Welcome back to another episode of True Crime Untold Cases. I'm your host, Harper Quinn. Today, we venture into the mind of one of America's most methodical serial killers, Israel Keyes. For over a decade, this unassuming construction worker traveled across Alaska and the lower 48 states, burying kill kits years before committing his crimes. Unlike most serial killers, Keyes had no victim type, no signature, and deliberately avoided patterns that might connect his murders. His meticulous planning and random victim selection made him nearly impossible to catch, until a single mistake led to his capture in 2012. What followed was a chilling series of confessions that shocked even seasoned investigators. Join me as we unravel the disturbing case of a predator who hid in plain sight. In the vast wilderness of Alaska, where the harshness of nature often overshadows the darkness that can lurk in human hearts, one man moved like a shadow across the landscape. His name was Israel Keyes, and beneath his unremarkable exterior existed one of the most methodical and calculating serial killers in American history. Israel Keyes wasn't like other serial killers. He didn't have a specific type of victim. He didn't kill in a specific geographic area. He didn't follow the patterns that investigators have come to recognize in serial offenders. Instead, he meticulously planned his crimes, sometimes years in advance, burying kill kits containing weapons, cash, and supplies across the country. He would fly to one location, rent a car, and drive hundreds of miles to commit his crimes, ensuring no connection could be made between him and his victims. Born on January 7, 1978 in Richmond, Utah, Keyes was raised in a large family that eventually moved to rural Colville, Washington. The Keyes family lived off the grid in a cabin without electricity or running water. They were part of a fundamentalist Christian community, and young Israel was homeschooled with religious teachings. However, as he grew older, he rejected these beliefs, eventually identifying as an atheist. Keyes served in the United States Army from 1998 to 2001, stationed at Fort Lewis, Fort Hood, and in Egypt. It was during this time that he began to develop the skills that would later serve him in his crimes: survival techniques, discipline, and an understanding of how to move undetected. After leaving the military, Keyes started his own construction business, Keyes Construction, and became known as a reliable contractor in Anchorage, Alaska, where he had settled. To his neighbors, clients, and even his girlfriend and daughter, he appeared to be nothing more than a hard-working businessman. This carefully constructed facade allowed him to hide in plain sight for years. What makes the case of Israel Keyes particularly chilling is not just the number of his victims, which remains unknown, but the extraordinary lengths he went to in order to avoid detection. Keyes was not driven by the same impulses as many serial killers. He didn't seek fame or recognition. He didn't taunt law enforcement. He didn't leave clues. In fact, he did everything possible to ensure that his crimes would never be connected to each other or to him. "I'm two different people," Keyes once told investigators after his arrest. "The person that did this, and the person who is sitting here right now. It's not like a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde thing. It's not like I'm fighting with myself or anything. It's just, I just lived two different lives." The first confirmed murder committed by Keyes was that of Samantha Koenig, an 18-year-old barista who was abducted from the Common Grounds espresso stand in Anchorage on February 1, 2012. Security footage showed a man wearing a ski mask approaching the coffee stand just before closing time. That man was Israel Keyes. Keyes forced Samantha at gunpoint into his white Chevrolet pickup truck and drove her to his home. There, he sexually assaulted her and strangled her to death. What happened next demonstrates the cold, calculated nature of Keyes' crimes. He departed on a pre-planned cruise with his family, leaving Samantha's body in a shed behind his house. Upon his return more than a week later, Keyes set about creating the illusion that Samantha was still alive. He sewed her eyes open with fishing line to make it appear as though she was conscious. He then posed her body with a copy of the Anchorage Daily News dated February 13, 2012, nearly 2 weeks after her abduction, and took a Polaroid photograph. Using this photo, Keyes demanded a $30,000 ransom from Samantha's family, directing them to deposit the money into her bank account. After the ransom was paid, Keyes dismembered Samantha's body and disposed of it in Matanuska Lake, north of Anchorage. He then began using the debit card connected to Samantha's account, making withdrawals across the southwestern United States, a fatal mistake that would eventually lead to his capture. Law enforcement tracked the withdrawals, and on March 13, 2012, Keyes was pulled over by Texas Highway Patrol in Lufkin, Texas. Inside his car, they found the debit card used to make the withdrawals, along with Samantha's cell phone and other evidence linking him to her abduction. What followed was a series of confessions that shocked even the most seasoned investigators. Over the course of numerous interviews, Keyes admitted to at least 8 murders across the United States, though the true number may be much higher. He provided details about his methods, his motivations, and his victims, but he was selective about what information he shared, using it as a bargaining chip to negotiate conditions of his imprisonment. One of the murders Keyes confessed to was that of Bill and Lorraine Currier, a couple from Essex, Vermont. In June 2011, Keyes flew from Alaska to Chicago, rented a car, and drove to Vermont. He had no connection to the Curriers. They were chosen at random. Keyes broke into their home, bound them, and forced them into his rental car. He drove them to an abandoned farmhouse, where he shot Bill Currier and sexually assaulted and strangled Lorraine Currier. Their bodies were never found, as the farmhouse was demolished before investigators learned of their fate. Keyes also admitted to the murders of 4 unidentified victims in Washington state and 1 in New York, though he refused to provide names or specific details that would allow authorities to identify these victims. He claimed to have killed a couple in Washington state sometime between 2001 and 2005, and to have abducted and murdered a woman on the East Coast in April 2009, disposing of her body in New York's Tupper Lake. What set Keyes apart from other serial killers was his meticulous planning. He would bury kill kits, caches of weapons, cash, and supplies, in various locations around the country, sometimes years before he intended to use them. He would then return to these locations when he was ready to commit a murder, ensuring that he had everything he needed without having to make suspicious purchases in the area where he planned to kill. He had these caches buried all over the United States, said FBI Special Agent Jolene Godin, who was involved in the investigation, so he could fly to a location, recover his weapons, and then commit his crimes without any evidence tying him to the area. Keyes was also careful to avoid leaving any evidence that could connect him to his crimes. He didn't use credit cards or cell phones that could be traced. He chose victims who lived far from his home. He avoided areas with security cameras, and he targeted strangers, people with whom he had no connection, making it nearly impossible for investigators to identify him as a suspect. In some ways, he was unprecedented, said Kevin Donovan, former special agent in charge of the FBI's Anchorage division. The level of planning, the level of preparation, the level of forethought he put into these crimes is unlike anything we've seen before. Keyes's confessions were not motivated by remorse or a desire to provide closure to the families of his victims. Instead, he used the information as a form of currency, trading details about his crimes for privileges in prison. He wanted to avoid being transferred to a maximum security facility. He wanted to ensure that his daughter would not learn about his crimes from the media, and he wanted control over what information was released to the public. He was playing a game with us, said Anchorage Police Detective Jeff Bell. He would give us just enough information to keep us interested, but not enough to solve all the cases. He was in control, even from behind bars. During his interviews with law enforcement, Keyes provided insights into his mindset and motivations. He described how he would fantasize about committing crimes from a young age and how these fantasies evolved over time. He talked about the thrill he got from planning and executing his crimes and the sense of power he felt when controlling his victims. He told us that he enjoyed the planning almost as much as the actual crime, said FBI Special Agent Colleen Sanders. He would spend months, sometimes years, preparing for a murder. It was like a hobby for him. Keyes also revealed that he was fascinated by other serial killers, particularly Ted Bundy. He studied their methods, their mistakes, and the investigations that led to their capture, using this information to refine his own approach and avoid detection. Despite his cooperation with authorities, Keyes was determined to maintain some level of control over his narrative. He refused to provide the names of most of his victims, stating that he wanted to protect their families from the media attention that would follow. However, investigators believed that this was just another way for Keyes to maintain power, by keeping secrets that only he knew. The psychological profile of Israel Keyes is complex and disturbing. Unlike many serial killers who are driven by sexual impulses or childhood trauma, Keyes seemed to be motivated primarily by the thrill of committing the perfect crime. He enjoyed the challenge of planning and executing murders without getting caught, and he took pride in his ability to live a double life, appearing normal and unremarkable to those around him while harboring dark and violent fantasies. "I'm not crazy. I know that I'm outside of the realm of normal behavior," Keyes told investigators. "I choose to be that way." What makes the case of Israel Keyes particularly haunting is the randomness of his victim selection. Most serial killers target specific types of victims, often based on gender, age, or appearance. But Keyes had no such preferences. His victims included men and women, young and old. The only criteria was that they were vulnerable, and that killing them would not immediately connect back to him. This randomness made Keyes incredibly difficult to catch. Traditional investigative techniques rely on finding connections between the perpetrator and the victim, or identifying patterns in the selection of victims. But with Keyes, there were no connections, no patterns. Each crime was isolated, committed far from his home, against victims with whom he had no prior contact. The story of Israel Keyes is not just a tale of horror and violence. It's also a cautionary tale about the limitations of our understanding of serial killers. For decades, law enforcement and behavioral analysts have developed profiles and patterns to help identify and capture these offenders. But Keyes defied these patterns. He didn't fit the mold, and as a result, he was able to kill with impunity for more than a decade. On December 2, 2012, Israel Keyes was found dead in his cell at the Anchorage Correctional Complex. He had cut his wrists and strangled himself with a sheet, leaving behind a rambling 4-page suicide note written in blood. The note contained no information about his crimes or his victims, only a mix of poetry and disjointed thoughts that provided no closure for the families of those he had killed. With Keyes' death, many questions remained unanswered. How many people did he kill? Where are the bodies of his unidentified victims? Are there more kill kits buried across the country, waiting to be discovered? Investigators continued to work on the case after Keyes' death, trying to piece together his movements over the years and identify his victims. They created a timeline of his travels, cross-referencing it with unsolved murders and disappearances in those areas. But the task was daunting. Keyes had traveled extensively throughout the United States, and without more specific information from him, connecting him to particular crimes was extremely difficult. One of the most chilling aspects of the Keyes case is the realization that there may be families out there who have no idea that their missing loved ones were victims of this methodical killer. They continue to search, to hope, to wonder, unaware that the answers they seek died with Israel Keyes. The FBI has released information about Keyes' travels and activities in the hope that it might generate leads or connections to unsolved cases. They've asked the public for help, hoping that someone might remember seeing Keyes or his vehicle in their area, or might have information that could link him to a disappearance or murder. In the years since Keyes' death, investigators have continued to study his methods and motivations, hoping to learn from this case and apply those lessons to the detection and capture of other offenders. They've analyzed his interviews, his writings, and the evidence from his known crimes, trying to build a more complete picture of this enigmatic killer. The case of Israel Keyes serves as a stark reminder that even in our modern age of advanced forensic techniques and behavioral analysis, some predators can still move among us undetected. It reminds us that evil often wears an unremarkable face, hiding behind a facade of normalcy. For the families of Keyes' known victims, Samantha Koenig, Bill and Lorraine Currier, there is at least some measure of closure. They know what happened to their loved ones, even if that knowledge brings its own kind of pain. But for the families of his unidentified victims, there is only uncertainty and unanswered questions. The story of Israel Keyes is not just a true crime narrative. It's a cautionary tale about the darkness that can exist within seemingly ordinary people. It's a reminder that sometimes the monsters are not hiding under the bed or in the shadows. Sometimes they're hiding in plain sight, living next door, working alongside us, blending seamlessly into the fabric of our communities. As we delve deeper into the psyche of Israel Keyes, we must confront the disturbing reality that he represents a rare category of serial killer, one who killed not out of uncontrollable impulse, but with deliberate, methodical planning. The FBI has classified Keyes as a traveling serial killer, a designation that highlights the unique challenge he presented to law enforcement. During his extensive interviews with authorities, Keyes revealed a chilling aspect of his methodology: his use of what investigators came to call kill kits. These caches, buried in remote locations across the United States, contained weapons, tools, and supplies necessary for abduction, murder, and body disposal. The premeditation involved is staggering. Keyes would bury these kits years before returning to use them, demonstrating a level of patience and long-term planning rarely seen in serial offenders. He talked about how he would go into an area, and sometimes years in advance, he would bury a container, a kill kit, for lack of a better term, explained FBI Special Agent Jolene Godin in a later interview. And it would have weapons, it would have cash, it would have items to dispose of a body. One such kit was recovered by authorities in New York in April 2013, months after Keyes' suicide. The kit, buried near the shore of Parishville Reservoir in upstate New York, contained a handgun, silencer, ammunition, and other items that Keyes had stashed for future use. The discovery confirmed his claims about these prepared caches and raised disturbing questions about how many more might remain undiscovered across the country. Keyes' approach to selecting victims was equally calculated. Unlike most serial killers who target specific types of people based on personal preference or fantasy, Keyes selected targets based primarily on accessibility and the likelihood of getting away with the crime. He sought out homes that were set back from the road, that had no dogs, and where he could control the environment. He preferred locations near parks, wooded areas, or cemeteries, places where he could quickly disappear after committing his crimes. It was a remote area, the house was set back a little bit from the road, and there weren't any close neighbors, Keyes said when describing how he selected the Currier home in Vermont. There was no dog, which was important. This approach to victim selection based on opportunity rather than type, made Keyes particularly dangerous and difficult to apprehend. Traditional profiling methods often rely on identifying patterns in victim characteristics, but Keyes defied such categorization. His victims were connected only by their vulnerability and isolation. During his confessions, Keyes provided details about his first murder, which he claimed occurred in Washington state between 2001 and 2005. While he refused to identify the victim, he described abducting a couple from a state park, though he would not specify which one. This revelation was particularly disturbing to investigators, as it suggested that Keyes had been killing for much longer than initially suspected. His first victims were in Washington state, confirmed FBI Special Agent Maureen Less. He didn't give us the names. He didn't give us the exact location. But he did tell us that his first victims were a couple that he abducted from a state park. Keyes also admitted to killing a person in New York in 2009, disposing of the body in Tupper Lake in the Adirondack Mountains. Again, he refused to provide the victim's name or specific details about the abduction, using this information as leverage in his negotiations with authorities. What made Keyes' confessions particularly frustrating for investigators was his selective disclosure. He would provide enough information to establish his credibility as the perpetrator, but withhold key details that would allow for identification of victims or recovery of remains. This strategy allowed him to maintain control over the investigation, even while incarcerated. He was very, very, very careful about what information he gave us, said Anchorage police officer Jeff Bell. He gave us just enough information for us to believe what he was saying, but not enough for us to go out and find the victims that he wouldn't tell us about. Through painstaking investigation, authorities were able to piece together a timeline of Keyes' movements over the years, cross-referencing his known locations with unsolved disappearances and murders. They confirmed that between 2001 and 2012, Keyes had traveled to multiple states, including Washington, New York, New Jersey, Vermont, Pennsylvania, Texas, Alaska, Colorado, Utah, Oregon, California, and others. He had also taken trips to Canada, Mexico, and Belize. During these travels, Keyes would often rent cars and drive hundreds or even thousands of miles, staying in remote areas and paying cash to avoid leaving an electronic trail. He was meticulous about not creating connections between himself and his crimes, often committing murders far from his home and in areas where he had no personal ties. He told us that he would fly to an airport, rent a car, and then drive sometimes 500 to 1,000 miles away from that airport, explained FBI Special Agent Steve Payne. Then he would find a victim in that area so that there would be no connection between him and that area or him and that victim. This level of planning extended to every aspect of his crimes. Keyes would disable phones and security systems before entering homes. He would bring his own murder kit containing weapons, restraints, and tools. He would avoid leaving DNA evidence by wearing gloves and carefully controlling the crime scene. And he would dispose of bodies in remote locations, often in bodies of water, making them difficult or impossible to recover. The case of Bill and Lorraine Currier provides a stark example of Keyes' methodology. In June 2011, Keyes flew from Alaska to Chicago, rented a car, and drove to Vermont, a state he had no connection to. He recovered a kill kit he had buried in the area years earlier, which contained a gun, silencer, and other supplies. He then selected the Currier's home based on its isolated location and lack of security measures. On the night of June 8, 2011, Keyes cut the phone lines to the Currier's home and broke in through a window. He found the couple in their bedroom, bound them with zip ties, and forced them into his rental car. He drove them to an abandoned farmhouse where he separated the couple. He took Bill Currier to the basement where he shot him. He then returned upstairs and sexually assaulted Lorraine Currier before strangling her to death. Keyes later disposed of the bodies in an undisclosed location. By the time he confessed to these murders, the abandoned farmhouse had been demolished, and despite extensive searches, the Curriers' remains have never been found. What is particularly disturbing about the Currier murders is that Keyes had no personal connection to the couple. They were not chosen for any specific characteristic other than the vulnerability of their home and its location. This random selection process made the crimes virtually impossible to solve without a confession. The Curriers were complete strangers to him, noted FBI Special Agent Kristen Caldwell. He had no connection to them whatsoever. They were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Throughout his interviews with authorities, Keyes demonstrated an unusual self-awareness about his criminal behavior. Unlike many serial killers who deny responsibility or claim to be driven by uncontrollable urges, Keyes acknowledged that his actions were choices he made consciously. "I'm two different people," he told investigators. "The person who did these things is not the same person who is sitting here talking to you now. But I'm not going to blame it on anything. I knew what I was doing." This level of self-awareness extended to his understanding of how serial killers are typically caught. Keyes had studied the cases of other serial murderers, learning from their mistakes and developing strategies to avoid detection. He was particularly interested in the case of Ted Bundy, whose capture came after he began killing in a single area and developing a recognizable pattern. He was a student of other serial killers, explained FBI profiler Mary Ellen O'Toole. He learned what not to do. He learned how other serial killers had been caught, and he was determined not to repeat those mistakes. Keyes' knowledge of law enforcement techniques was evident in his careful avoidance of digital footprints. He rarely used credit cards or cell phones that could be traced. When he did use technology, such as in the case of withdrawing money from Samantha Koenig's account, he did so in a way that he believed would misdirect investigators, making withdrawals in areas far from where the crimes occurred. He understood cell phone tracking. He understood credit card tracking. He understood that every time you use an ATM, you're being videotaped, said Anchorage Police Chief Mark Mew. He understood all of that, and he worked very hard to avoid creating those kinds of records. The exception to this careful approach came after the abduction and murder of Samantha Koenig. In what investigators believe was a break from his usual pattern, Keyes used Koenig's debit card to withdraw money from ATMs across the southwestern United States. This deviation from his typically cautious behavior ultimately led to his capture. On March 13, 2012, Texas Highway Patrol officers pulled over Keyes' rental car in Lufkin, Texas, after it was identified as being connected to the withdrawals from Koenig's account. Inside the car, they found evidence linking him to Koenig's abduction, including her cell phone and the debit card used for the withdrawals. Following his arrest, Keyes initially denied involvement in Koenig's disappearance. However, as the evidence against him mounted, he began to negotiate with authorities, offering information about his crimes in exchange for certain concessions. These included a pledge not to reveal the full extent of his crimes to the media, a quick trial and sentencing, and imprisonment in a federal facility where he could have access to certain amenities. Over the course of numerous interviews spanning from April to December 2012, Keyes gradually revealed details about his crimes. He admitted to the murders of Samantha Koenig and the Curriers, as well as to at least 5 other unidentified victims. He described his methods, his motivations, and his movements over the years. These confessions were not motivated by remorse or a desire for redemption. Instead, they were part of a calculated strategy to control the narrative around his crimes and to secure the conditions he wanted for his imprisonment. Keyes was selective about what information he provided, often using details about his unidentified victims as bargaining chips in his negotiations with authorities, He wanted to control the flow of information, explained FBI Special Agent Jolene Godin. He wanted to decide what we knew and when we knew it. It was all about maintaining control for him. Despite his cooperation, Keyes never provided a complete accounting of his crimes. He refused to identify most of his victims, claiming that he wanted to protect their families from media attention. However, investigators believed that this was just another form of control. By withholding information, Keyes ensured that he remained the only person who knew the full extent of his crimes. As the interviews progressed, Keyes began to show signs of deteriorating mental health. He became increasingly agitated and less cooperative. He expressed frustration with the pace of the legal proceedings and with what he perceived as breaches of his agreement with authorities regarding media coverage of his case. On December 2, 2012, Israel Keyes was found dead in his cell at the Anchorage Correctional Complex. He had cut his wrists with a razor blade that he had managed to conceal from guards and had strangled himself with a sheet. He left behind a suicide note, written in blood on both sides of several sheets of legal paper. The note, which was later released to the public in redacted form, contained no information about his crimes or his victims. Instead, it consisted of rambling, incoherent poetry and disjointed thoughts. One passage read, "Speak soft into a dead man's ear, death hath no ears to lend. Speak loud into a dead man's ear, death hath no fear to fend." Keyes's suicide left many questions unanswered. Investigators had been hopeful that with time and continued negotiation, he might provide more information about his unidentified victims, allowing for closure for their families. With his death, that possibility was lost. "It was incredibly frustrating," said FBI Special Agent Darren Jones. "We were just beginning to scratch the surface of what he had done. There was so much more we needed to learn from him, so many more families who deserved answers." In the years since Keyes's death, investigators have continued to work on identifying his victims and understanding the full scope of his crimes. They have released information about his travels and activities, hoping that it might generate leads or connections to unsolved cases. The FBI has created a timeline of Keyes's movements between 2001 and 2012, based on travel records, financial transactions, and his own statements. They have asked the public for help in identifying potential victims, particularly in areas where Keyes is known to have traveled and where there are unsolved disappearances or murders. One of the challenges in connecting Keyes to specific crimes is the lack of a consistent method or signature. Unlike many serial killers who develop a particular way of killing that becomes their hallmark, Keyes varied his approach based on the circumstances. He abducted some victims from their homes, others from public places. He used different weapons and different methods of disposal. This variation makes it difficult to identify his crimes without specific information from him. "He was adaptable," explained FBI profiler Mark Safarik. "He didn't have a signature that we could look for in unsolved cases. He changed his methods based on the situation, which makes it incredibly difficult to link him to specific crimes without a confession or direct evidence." Despite these challenges, investigators have made some progress in understanding the extent of Keyes's crimes. They have identified several unsolved cases that match his known movements and methods, though without conclusive evidence, they cannot definitively attribute these crimes to him. One such case is the disappearance of Suzanne Lyle, a 19-year-old student at the State University of New York at Albany, who vanished in March 1998. Keyes is known to have been in the area at the time, and the circumstances of Lyle's disappearance align with his methods. However, without more specific information, investigators cannot confirm whether Keyes was responsible. Another potential victim is Deborah Feldman, who disappeared from Hackensack, New Jersey, in April 2009. Keyes mentioned killing a woman in New Jersey around this time, and disposing of her body in upstate New York. While the timing and location match Feldman's disappearance, Keyes never confirmed her as a victim, and her remains have not been found. The FBI has also investigated potential connections between Keyes and the disappearances of several individuals from Washington state between 2001 and 2005, the period when Keyes claimed to have committed his first murders. These include Kathy and Larry Frager, who disappeared from their home in Enumclaw, Washington in 2003, and Karen Bossett, who vanished from Bellingham in 2005. Again, without specific confirmation from Keyes, these connections remain speculative. What makes the Keyes case particularly haunting is the knowledge that there are likely families out there who have no idea that their missing loved ones were victims of this methodical killer. They continue to search, to hope, to wonder, unaware that the answers they seek died with Israel Keyes. That's the most tragic aspect of this case, said FBI victim specialist Jolene Godin. There are families who don't know that we have the answer to what happened to their loved ones. They're still waiting for a knock on the door or a phone call that will never come. The case of Israel Keyes has had a significant impact on how law enforcement approaches the investigation of serial murders. It has highlighted the limitations of traditional profiling methods and the challenges posed by killers who deliberately avoid patterns and connections. In response, the FBI has developed new investigative techniques and technologies to better identify and track such offenders. They have enhanced their ability to analyze travel patterns, financial transactions, and digital footprints. They have also improved coordination between different jurisdictions, recognizing that traveling killers like Keyes require a national approach to investigation. The Keyes case changed how we think about serial murder, explained FBI Assistant Director Catherine Schweit. It showed us that we need to look beyond traditional patterns and be prepared for offenders who are deliberately trying to avoid detection by crossing jurisdictional boundaries. The case has also had an impact on public awareness of personal safety. The random nature of Keyes' victim selection is a stark reminder that predators can target anyone, regardless of demographic characteristics or lifestyle choices. This has led to increased emphasis on basic security measures and situational awareness. What the Keyes case teaches us is that sometimes it's not about who you are, but where you are and how vulnerable you appear, said security expert Robert Siciliano. It's about making yourself a harder target by being aware of your surroundings and taking basic precautions. For the families of Keyes' known victims, Samantha Koenig, Bill and Lorraine Currier, there is at least some measure of closure. They know what happened to their loved ones, even if that knowledge brings its own kind of pain. But for the families of his unidentified victims, there is only uncertainty and unanswered questions. Not knowing is its own kind of torture, said Mary Lyle, mother of missing student Suzanne Lyle, who may have been one of Keyes' victims. You can't grieve properly, you can't move forward, you're stuck in this limbo of not knowing whether to hope or to mourn. The story of Israel Keyes continues to fascinate and disturb true crime enthusiasts and law enforcement professionals alike. It represents a rare glimpse into the mind of a killer who operated outside the established patterns and profiles that investigators have come to rely on. It challenges our understanding of serial murder and forces us to confront the unsettling reality that some predators can move among us undetected, hiding behind a facade of normalcy. What makes Keyes so frightening is that he could be anyone, noted criminologist Dr. Scott Bonn. He wasn't the stereotypical loner with obvious social problems. He was a businessman, a father, a neighbor. He blended in. And that's what allowed him to kill for so long without being caught. The case of Israel Keyes continues to resonate within law enforcement and the true crime community as one of the most methodical and elusive serial killers in American history. His suicide left investigators with more questions than answers and the work to identify his unknown victims continues to this day. What makes the investigation particularly challenging is that Keyes deliberately operated in a way that defied the conventional understanding of serial killers. FBI behavioral analysts have noted that most serial offenders develop a comfort zone. They kill within a geographic area they know well and target victims who fit a specific profile. Keyes, however, did the opposite. He traveled thousands of miles to commit his crimes, targeted strangers with no connection to him, and varied his methods to prevent investigators from linking his crimes together. Most serial killers develop a pattern, a signature that helps us connect their crimes, explained FBI profiler John Douglas in a later interview about the case. Keyes was different. He studied other killers and deliberately avoided creating patterns. He knew that patterns are what get you caught. During his interviews with the FBI, Keyes provided tantalizing but frustratingly vague details about his other crimes. He mentioned killing a couple in Washington state between 2001 and 2005, and he claimed responsibility for 4 additional murders, including victims in New York and New Jersey. But he refused to provide names or specific locations that would allow investigators to identify these victims definitively. The FBI has been particularly interested in Keyes' activities during his time in Washington state. Between 2001 and 2007, Keyes lived in Near Bay, a small community on the Marca Reservation in the northwestern corner of Washington. During this period, he worked as a general contractor and is known to have traveled extensively throughout the Pacific Northwest. Investigators have examined numerous unsolved disappearances and murders in the region during this time frame. One case of particular interest is the disappearance of Deborah Everest and Clyde Darn, a couple who vanished from Washington in 2004. The circumstances of their disappearance align with what Keyes described about his first victims, a couple taken from a remote location, but without more specific information from Keyes before his death, a definitive connection cannot be established. Another potential victim is Deborah Feldman, who disappeared from her home in Hackensack, New Jersey in April 2009. Keyes admitted to killing someone in New Jersey around this time and disposing of the body in upstate New York. The timing and location match Feldman's disappearance, but again, Keyes never confirmed her identity, and her remains have not been found. "We believe there are still bodies out there," said FBI Special Agent Jolene Godin in a 2013 interview. "We believe there are still families who don't know that their loved ones were victims of Israel Keyes. That's what drives us to continue this investigation even after his death." One of the most chilling aspects of Keyes' methodology was his use of kill kits. These caches, buried in various locations across the country, contained weapons, tools, cash, and supplies necessary for abduction, murder, and body disposal. The premeditation involved is staggering. Keyes would bury these kits years before returning to use them. In April 2013, 4 months after Keyes' suicide, the FBI recovered one such kit in upstate New York. Buried near the shore of Parishville Reservoir, the kit contained a handgun, silencer, ammunition, and other items that Keyes had stashed for future use. The discovery confirmed his claims about these prepared caches and raised disturbing questions about how many more might remain undiscovered across the country. The fact that he would plan so far in advance, burying these kits years before he intended to use them, speaks to his level of dedication to his crimes, explained forensic psychologist Dr. Catherine Ramsland. This wasn't impulsive behavior. This wasn't someone who couldn't control his urges. This was someone who made a deliberate choice to kill and took extraordinary steps to avoid detection. Keyes' approach to selecting victims was equally calculated. Unlike most serial killers who target specific types of people based on personal preference or fantasy, Keyes selected targets based primarily on accessibility and the likelihood of getting away with the crime. He sought out homes that were set back from the road, that had no dogs, and where he could control the environment. It wasn't about who they were, Keyes told investigators. It was about the circumstances. It was about opportunity. This approach to victim selection, based on opportunity rather than type, made Keyes particularly dangerous and difficult to apprehend. Traditional profiling methods often rely on identifying patterns in victim characteristics, but Keyes defied such categorization. His victims were connected only by their vulnerability and isolation. During his confessions, Keyes provided a disturbing insight into his mindset when committing these crimes. He described feeling a sense of excitement and power during the planning and execution phases. He talked about the thrill of controlling his victims and the satisfaction he derived from knowing he could commit these acts and return to his normal life without anyone suspecting him. He told us that he enjoyed the planning almost as much as the actual crime, said FBI Special Agent Colleen Sanders. He would spend months, sometimes years, preparing for a murder. It was like a hobby for him. Keyes also revealed that he was fascinated by other serial killers, particularly Ted Bundy. He studied their methods, their mistakes, and the investigations that led to their capture, using this information to refine his own approach and avoid detection. He was a student of true crime, explained FBI profiler Mary Ellen O'Toole. He learned what not to do. He learned how other serial killers had been caught, and he was determined not to repeat those mistakes. What made Keyes' confessions particularly frustrating for investigators was his selective disclosure. He would provide enough information to establish his credibility as the perpetrator, but withhold key details that would allow for identification of victims or recovery of remains. This strategy allowed him to maintain control over the investigation even while incarcerated. He was very, very careful about what information he gave us, said Anchorage police officer Jeff Bell. He gave us just enough information for us to believe what he was saying, but not enough for us to go out and find the victims that he wouldn't tell us about. Through painstaking investigation, authorities were able to piece together a timeline of Keyes' movements over the years, cross-referencing his known locations with unsolved disappearances and murders. They confirmed that between 2001 and 2012, Keyes had traveled to multiple states, including Washington, New York, New Jersey, Vermont, Pennsylvania, Texas, Alaska, Colorado, Utah, Oregon, California, and others. He had also taken trips to Canada, Mexico, and Belize. The FBI has released this timeline to the public, hoping that it might generate leads or connections to unsolved cases. They've asked anyone with information about Keyes' activities or potential victims to come forward, emphasizing that even small details could be crucial in identifying his victims and providing closure to their families. One of the most significant challenges in the Keyes investigation has been determining the total number of his victims. During his interviews, Keyes claimed to have killed less than a dozen people, but investigators believe the actual number may be higher. His extensive travels, his careful planning, and his ability to avoid detection suggest that he may have committed more crimes than he admitted to. We may never know the full extent of his crimes, said FBI Special Agent Darren Jones. Without his cooperation, we're left to piece together what we can from travel records, financial transactions, and unsolved cases that match his methods. It's like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Despite these challenges, investigators have made some progress in understanding the scope of Keyes' crimes. They have identified several unsolved cases that match his known movements and methods, though without conclusive evidence, they cannot definitively attribute these crimes to him. In addition to the cases already mentioned, investigators have looked into potential connections between Keyes and the disappearances of several other individuals, including Susie Lyle a 19-year-old student who disappeared from the State University of New York at Albany in March 1998. Keyes is known to have been in the area at the time. Suzanne Jovin, a Yale University student who was stabbed to death in New Haven, Connecticut in December 1998. Keyes was living in New York State at the time and could have traveled to Connecticut. The Currier case itself was only solved because Keyes confessed to it. Prior to his confession, the disappearance of Bill and Lorraine Currier was an unsolved missing persons case with few leads. There was no physical evidence linking Keyes to the crime, and without his confession, it likely would have remained unsolved. This pattern, crimes committed with such care that they remain unsolved until the perpetrator confesses, suggests that there may be many more victims of Israel Keyes whose cases have never been connected to him and may never be. The psychological profile of Israel Keyes presents a challenge to our understanding of serial killers. Unlike many such offenders who are driven by sexual impulses, childhood trauma, or psychosis, Keyes seemed to be motivated primarily by the thrill of committing the perfect crime. He enjoyed the challenge of planning and executing murders without getting caught, and he took pride in his ability to live a double life. "I'm not crazy," Keyes told investigators. "I know that I'm outside of the realm of normal behavior. I choose to be that way." This level of self-awareness is unusual among serial killers, many of whom deny responsibility for their actions or claim to be driven by uncontrollable urges. Keyes, by contrast, acknowledged that his actions were choices he made consciously. He didn't blame his childhood. He didn't blame society. He didn't blame some inner demon, said forensic psychologist Dr. Robert Hare. He owned his actions in a way that's rare among serial offenders. That makes him, in some ways, even more disturbing. Keyes' background offers few clues to the development of his homicidal tendencies. He was born in 1978 in Richmond, Utah, one of 10 children in a Mormon family. When he was young, his family moved to a rural area near Colville, Washington, where they lived in a cabin without electricity or running water. The family later became involved with a fundamentalist Christian group known as the Ark, and Keyes was homeschooled with religious teachings. As a teenager, Keyes began to reject these religious beliefs. He became interested in Satanism and developed a fascination with death and violence. However, many adolescents go through phases of interest in dark or taboo subjects without becoming violent offenders, and there is no clear link between these teenage interests and his later crimes. Keyes served in the United States Army from 1998 to 2001, stationed at Fort Lewis, Fort Hood, and in Egypt. By all accounts, he was a competent soldier who did not exhibit any behavior that would have flagged him as a potential threat. After leaving the military, he started his own construction business and became known as a reliable contractor in the communities where he lived. To those who knew him, his neighbors, his clients, his girlfriend and daughter, Keyes appeared to be nothing more than a hard-working businessman. This carefully constructed facade allowed him to hide in plain sight for years. "He was just a normal guy," said one of Keyes' former neighbors in Anchorage. "He kept to himself, but not in a way that seemed odd. He was just private. If you had told me he was a serial killer, I would have laughed at you." This ability to blend in, to appear normal and unremarkable, is one of the most frightening aspects of Keyes' case. It challenges the common perception that there must be visible signs of deviance or disturbance in someone capable of such heinous acts. The scary thing about Israel Keyes is that he could be anyone, noted criminologist Dr. Scott Bonn. He wasn't the stereotypical loner with obvious social problems. He was a businessman, a father, a neighbor. He blended in, and that's what allowed him to kill for so long without being caught. The case of Israel Keyes has had a significant impact on how law enforcement approaches the investigation of serial murders. It has highlighted the limitations of traditional profiling methods and the challenges posed by killers who deliberately avoid patterns and connections. In response, the FBI has developed new investigative techniques and technologies to better identify and track such offenders. They have enhanced their ability to analyze travel patterns, financial transactions, and digital footprints. They have also improved coordination between different jurisdictions, recognizing that traveling killers like Keyes require a national approach to investigation. The Keyes case changed how we think about serial murder, explained FBI Assistant Director Catherine Schweit. It showed us that we need to look beyond traditional patterns and be prepared for offenders who are deliberately trying to avoid detection by crossing jurisdictional boundaries. One of the most significant developments in the aftermath of the Keyes case has been the creation of the Highway Serial Killings Initiative, a program designed to track and identify potential serial killers who use the nation's highways to find victims and evade detection. While Keyes himself did not fit the typical profile of a highway killer, he didn't target prostitutes or hitchhikers along interstates. His case highlighted the challenges of investigating crimes committed across multiple jurisdictions. The FBI has also expanded its Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, VICAP, a database that allows law enforcement agencies across the country to share information about violent crimes. By entering details about unsolved murders, sexual assaults, and missing persons cases into the system, investigators can identify potential connections between crimes committed in different jurisdictions. Before VICAP, if a killer committed crimes in different states, it was very difficult for investigators to connect those crimes, explained FBI analyst Crystal Nozal. Now, we can enter the details of a case into the system and potentially match it with similar cases across the country. It's a powerful tool for identifying patterns that might otherwise go unnoticed. These technological advances and institutional changes represent a direct response to the challenges posed by killers like Israel Keyes. By improving communication between different law enforcement agencies and developing more sophisticated analytical tools, investigators hope to identify and apprehend such offenders before they can claim multiple victims. The case has also had an impact on public awareness of personal safety. The random nature of Keyes' victim selection is a stark reminder that predators can target anyone, regardless of demographic characteristics or lifestyle choices. This has led to increased emphasis on basic security measures and situational awareness. What the Keyes case teaches us is that sometimes it's not about who you are, but where you are and how vulnerable you appear, said security expert Robert Siciliano. It's about making yourself a harder target by being aware of your surroundings and taking basic precautions. These precautions include simple measures like ensuring homes have adequate security systems, being aware of one's surroundings in public places, and avoiding isolated areas, particularly at night. While such measures cannot guarantee safety, they can reduce vulnerability to predators who, like Keyes, seek out easy targets. For the families of Keyes' known victims, Samantha Koenig, Bill, and Lorraine Currier, there is at least some measure of closure. They know what happened to their loved ones, even if that knowledge brings its own kind of pain. But for the families of his unidentified victims, there is only uncertainty and unanswered questions. Not knowing is its own kind of torture, said Mary Lyle, mother of missing student Suzanne Lyle, who may have been one of Keyes' victims. You can't grieve properly, you can't move forward, you're stuck in this limbo of not knowing whether to hope or to mourn. The FBI continues to investigate potential connections between Keyes and unsolved cases, hoping to provide answers to families who have waited years or even decades to learn what happened to their loved ones. They have released information about Keyes' travels and activities, asking the public for help in identifying potential victims. We're still working on this case, said FBI Special Agent Jolene Godin in a recent update. We still believe there are victims out there who haven't been identified. We're committed to finding them and providing closure to their families. The story of Israel Keyes serves as a stark reminder that even in our modern age of advanced forensic techniques and behavioral analysis, some predators can still move among us undetected. It reminds us that evil often wears an unremarkable face, hiding behind a facade of normalcy. It also highlights the limitations of our understanding of serial killers. For decades, law enforcement and behavioral analysts have developed profiles and patterns to help identify and capture these offenders. But Keyes defied these patterns. He didn't fit the mold, and as a result, he was able to kill with impunity for more than a decade. The Keyes case is a humbling reminder that we don't have all the answers, said FBI profiler John Douglas. Just when we think we understand the psychology of serial murder, someone like Keyes comes along and challenges everything we thought we knew. As technology advances and investigative techniques improve, law enforcement agencies continue to adapt to the challenges posed by offenders like Israel Keyes. They develop new tools, new methods, and new approaches to identify and apprehend those who would prey on the vulnerable. But the case of Israel Keyes reminds us that the most dangerous predators are often those we least suspect. They don't look like monsters. They don't act like monsters. They blend in, hiding their true nature behind a carefully constructed facade of normalcy. And that perhaps is the most disturbing lesson of all, that sometimes the monsters are not hiding under the bed or in the shadows. Sometimes they're hiding in plain sight, living next door, working alongside us, blending seamlessly into the fabric of our communities. In December 2012, when Israel Keyes took his own life in his prison cell, he took with him the answers to questions that continue to haunt investigators and the families of his potential victims. How many people did he kill? Where are the bodies of his unidentified victims? Are there more kill kits buried across the country, waiting to be discovered? These questions may never be fully answered, but the investigation continues, driven by the hope that someday, somehow, the full truth about Israel Keyes' crimes will come to light, and the families of his victims will finally find the closure they deserve.